Ever wonder what marriage was like 1,000 years ago? Could a woman just pack her bags and leave if things weren't working out? What if she faced real hardship or worse? Picture this. It's the year 930 and you are a woman. And here's the shocking truth. Divorce, as we know it today, was practically a fantasy. Number 7. The iron grip of religious doctrine. Imagine waking up in the year 930. The air is probably thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, and the sounds of distant church bells or the call to prayer might float on the breeze depending on where you are in the world. But one thing is almost universally true across vast swaths of the known world, from the budding kingdoms of Europe to the sprawling caliphates of the Middle East. Religion isn't just something you do on a holy day. It's the very air you breathe, the bedrock of every law, every social custom, and every single decision you make. And when it comes to marriage, religion held an iron grip, making the very idea of divorce for women almost unthinkable. Let's start with Christian Europe, a mosaic of kingdoms and emerging empires where the influence of the church was growing stronger by the century. For followers of Christianity, marriage wasn't just a contract between two people. Oh no. It was seen as a sacred sacrament, a holy bond instituted by God Himself. Think about the words that would become famous. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a divine decree. The church taught that marriage was indissoluble, meaning it couldn't be broken. It was a union meant to last until death do us part. For a woman, this was a particularly heavy chain. Consider this. If you were a woman in 930 and your marriage was, say, utterly miserable, perhaps even abusive, where would you turn? Church courts held jurisdiction over marriage, and their primary goal was always to uphold the sanctity of the union. Trying to argue for a divorce, even if it was technically an annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place due to some fundamental flaw, was an uphill battle of epic proportions. You would be standing before a priest or a bishop, men trained in theology and law, deeply steeped in the very doctrines that proclaimed your marriage unbreakable. They would likely view your desire for separation not as a cry for help, but as an act against God's will, a transgression. Historians who delve into the legal and religious texts of this period consistently point to how deeply these beliefs permeated all levels of society. The church's teaching on marriage became entwined with secular law, meaning that even kings and powerful nobles faced pressure to conform to these doctrines. Furthermore, biblical interpretations from this era heavily emphasize male headship within the family and female submission. Passages advising wives to obey their husbands were taken literally and applied rigorously. This theological framework made it even harder for a woman to challenge her marital status. To seek a divorce was not just to challenge her husband, but to challenge a divinely ordained order. It was seen as a grave sin, risking not just social condemnation, but eternal damnation. Imagine the sheer terror of that prospect in a deeply religious society. Even in situations where a man might have some leeway to put his wife away, perhaps in certain Germanic or Anglo-Saxon legal traditions that predated full church dominance, or in specific cases like adultery, a woman initiating such a move was almost unheard of. The double standard was stark. A man's ability to discard a wife, while not openly endorsed by the church, was sometimes tolerated in practice, especially among the powerful. But a woman attempting to leave her husband was seen as defying nature, God, and societal order. Think about the local priest in your village or town. He wasn't just a spiritual guide. He was often a pillar of the community, an interpreter of divine law, and a strong moral authority. His sermons would reinforce the sacredness of marriage, the roles of husband and wife, and the dangers of sinful behavior. If you, as a woman, were to approach him seeking to leave your marriage, you would likely be met not with sympathy for your plight, but with admonishments to pray, to be patient, to fulfill your duties, and to reconcile with your husband. The idea of supporting a woman's desire for divorce simply did not compute within that religious worldview. Scholars who analyze the pastoral care and community structures of the 10th century consistently find that religious figures played a critical role in enforcing marital fidelity and permanence, especially for women. Even for the highest social classes, while they might have wielded more political power, they were not entirely immune to the Church's influence. Powerful noblewomen might, in rare and exceptional circumstances, secure an annulment, but this was usually a highly politicized process, often involving powerful families maneuvering for land or alliances and almost never initiated. It was a declaration that the marriage was never legitimate from the start, perhaps due to a lack of proper consent, a pre-existing vow, or a prohibited degree of kinship between the spouses. But it was not a divorce in the sense of ending a valid marriage. The very concept of ending a marriage that was seen as truly valid and blessed by God was fundamentally against the core tenets of the dominant religions of the time. The spiritual and moral consequences of attempting to break such a bond were considered so severe that they acted as a powerful, almost insurmountable deterrent for women. Number 6. Zero economic power. Picture yourself, a woman in 930, contemplating leaving your husband. You've considered the religious implications, and you know how dire they are. But then, a very practical, very terrifying thought would undoubtedly slam into you. How would I even survive? Because here's the deal. Women in 930, especially outside the tiny sliver of the extremely wealthy elite, possessed practically no independent economic power. This absolute lack of financial means was a towering wall, making the very idea of divorce a terrifying, impossible fantasy. In this patriarchal society, property ownership was overwhelmingly a male domain. Land, livestock, tools, and even houses were typically owned and controlled by men. If you were a woman, you might come into a marriage with a dowry, a sum of money or goods that your family provided to your husband's family. But here's the crucial part. That dowry typically became the property of your husband or his family. It wasn't your personal savings account that you could dip into if things went south. It was a contribution to the new household, and it often served as an incentive for the husband's family to accept the marriage. Historical records, from surviving wills to court documents, repeatedly show how women's economic lives were almost entirely entwined with and subordinate to their husbands or male relatives. Let's think about the reality of daily life. Most women's work was domestic, running the household, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing. If you lived on a farm, you'd be involved in agricultural labor. But that was family labor, part of the husband's farm, not a wage you earned independently. Some women might work as spinners, weavers, brewers, or midwives, but these were typically small-scale endeavors, generating just enough for subsistence, if that. They certainly weren't lucrative professions that would allow a woman to save up enough money to live independently, rent a house, or feed herself and any children she might somehow keep, which, spoiler alert, was exceedingly rare. Imagine being suddenly homeless and jobless, with literally no savings, no unemployment benefits, no social services, and no real prospect of finding independent work that would allow you to survive. Concept of a living was almost entirely dependent on being part of a household, under the protection and provision of a male head, even for noble women. The situation, while seemingly more comfortable, still presented a lack of independent economic power. A noblewoman's wealth was tied to her husband's estate or her birth family's lands. She might oversee the household, manage servants, or administer parts of the estate, but she didn't own it in her own right. If she were to leave her husband, she would lose access to all of it. Her elaborate gowns, her jewelry, her comfortable lodging, all of it was contingent on her position as wife. She would be stripped of everything, left with nothing but the clothes on her back, perhaps. Scholars who have studied medieval household economies consistently observe that a married woman's economic identity was almost entirely subsumed by her husband's. Consider the practical implications of this. If you left, where would you go? Your birth family, fearing the social stigma which we'll get to, might be reluctant to take you back, especially if you were seen as bringing shame upon them. Even if they did, you would be an enormous burden, a mouth to feed without contributing to the family's economic well-being, which was already a struggle for most. There was no concept of independent women living alone, supporting themselves through a career that was centuries away. The land was the primary source of wealth and power, and women rarely owned it outright. Inheritance customs often favored male heirs, ensuring that land stayed within the male line. Even if a woman inherited some property, it was usually under strict conditions or managed by a male relative or husband. To divorce meant to be utterly stripped of any connection to land or means of production. It meant facing absolute destitution. The very thought of it would have been terrifying enough to make most women endure almost any hardship within a marriage simply to ensure basic survival. The economic reality of 930-odd was a cruel trap, ensuring that for a woman, divorce was not just legally difficult or socially stigmatizing, but a death sentence in terms of livelihood and security. Number 5. The crushing weight of social stigma. Imagine a world where your reputation isn't just important, it's literally everything in 930. This was the reality. And if you, as a woman, were to consider divorce, you weren't just ending a marriage. You were shattering your reputation, your honor, and your very place in society. Crushing weight of social stigma was so immense that it acted as a powerful, unspoken barrier, making divorce for women almost unthinkable. In medieval society, the concept of honor was paramount, especially for women. A woman's honor was intricately tied to her purity before marriage, her fidelity within marriage, and her obedience to her husband and family. To be a divorced woman was to be damaged goods. It didn't matter whose fault the separation was. The mere fact of it would make you an outcast. People wouldn't necessarily blame your husband. They would blame you, or at least see you as tainted. Chroniclers and moralistic texts from the 10th century often paint a bleak picture of women who stepped outside societal norms, highlighting the intense pressure to conform to expectations surrounding marriage and family. Think about what this meant in daily life. Your social standing would plummet. You might be actively avoided. Other women might shun you, fearing that your perceived moral failing could somehow rub off on them. You wouldn't be invited to gatherings, communal feasts, or even simple neighborly visits. You would become a whispered about figure, a cautionary tale. Your children, if you somehow managed to keep them, which, as we'll explore, was incredibly rare, would also face stigma. They might be seen as illegitimate or simply as children of a failed marriage, and their prospects in life would be severely hampered. Then there's the question of remarriage. For a divorced woman in 930, remarriage was practically an impossibility. Who would take on a woman with such a reputation? She would be seen as disobedient, perhaps prone to challenging authority, or simply used goods. Her honor would be compromised beyond repair. While a widower might remarry, a divorced woman seeking a new husband was almost unheard of. Contrast this with our modern ideas of starting over or finding happiness after a divorce. That concept simply didn't exist for women in this era. For them, divorce was a permanent stain, a brand of social rejection that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Even widows, who were often in a better position than divorced women, as they hadn't failed in their marriage but rather lost their husband through no fault of their own, still faced social pressures. They might be encouraged to remarry quickly to secure their position or to enter a convent, but a divorced woman had no such clear path. She was seen as someone who had broken a sacred bond, and that was unforgivable in the eyes of society. Imagine the sheer courage, or perhaps desperation, it would take for a woman to defy such powerful social norms, to willingly invite such shame upon herself and her family, for that matter. The fear of social ostracization was a potent weapon in enforcing conformity. It wasn't just about what the law or the church said. It was about what your neighbors, your community, and even your own family thought of you. And in a time when community was everything, providing support, protection, and identity, to be cast out was akin to a social death sentence. The desire for personal happiness or freedom, even if she felt it, would be utterly dwarfed by the terrifying prospect of becoming a social pariah, a woman without honor, without a place. This unspoken yet profoundly powerful social pressure ensured that divorce for women remained firmly in the realm of the unthinkable. Number 4. Losing your children forever. Beyond the spiritual terror, the economic nightmare, and the crushing social shame, there was another, perhaps even more heart-wrenching reason why divorce was nearly impossible for women in 930. Add the almost certain knowledge that you would lose your children, likely forever. Imagine having to choose between your own freedom, your own safety, or even your very survival, and the unconditional love and presence of your children. For most women, this was no choice at all. It was an unbearable thought. In the early medieval period, societies were overwhelmingly patrilineal. This means that lineage, inheritance, and identity passed through the male line. Sons were absolutely crucial. They were the continuation of the family name, the heirs to the land, the bearers of the family's honor, and the ones who would care for their parents in old age. Daughters were valuable too often as means to form alliances through marriage. But sons were seen as the very foundation of the family's future. From a legal and customary standpoint, children were almost universally considered the property of the father and his family. They were seen as extensions of his lineage, not as separate individuals tied equally to both parents in the way we understand it today. If a marriage dissolved, especially if the woman initiated the separation, there was virtually no question of custody. The children, particularly the sons, would remain with the father's family. It was their right, their duty, and their very purpose to raise these children within their line. Legal customs and societal practices of the early medieval period consistently reinforced the father's absolute right to his children, particularly his sons, viewing them as essential to the continuity of his lineage and estate. Think about the emotional and psychological toll of this reality. If you were a woman in an abusive or simply unbearable marriage, the thought of leaving might offer a glimmer of hope. But then, you'd have to confront the cold, hard fact that walking away meant walking away from your children, probably with no legal recourse to visitation, no chance to see them grow up, no opportunity to guide them or share in their lives. They would be raised by your estranged husband and his family, possibly taught to resent or forget you for a mother. This prospect was a devastating deterrent. The bond between a mother and her children is timeless, and in a harsh world it was often the source of a woman's greatest joy and purpose. To sever that bond, to abandon her offspring to an uncertain future without her care, was an unthinkable sacrifice. Many women would have endured immense personal suffering within a marriage rather than face the anguish of losing their children permanently. Even in wealthier families, where wet nurses might care for infants and tutors for older children, the ultimate control and legal guardianship resided with the father. A noblewoman might have many children, but her access to them was entirely at her husband's discretion if they were separated. The children were tools of alliance and inheritance, part of the patrimony, not something to be divided in a separation. Imagine a woman trapped in a truly terrible marriage. She might dream of escape, but the image of her children growing up without her, perhaps never knowing her side of the story, or worse, being told negative things about her, would surely haunt her. This powerful primal bond acted as a nearly insurmountable obstacle to any thoughts of divorce. The desire to nurture, protect, and remain connected to her children, even from a distance, would anchor her to a difficult marriage more effectively than any law or religious decree. In a time when a woman's worth was so tied to her role as a mother, the penalty of losing her children forever was a price almost no woman could bring herself to pay. Number 3. The law was not on her side. Let's be honest, justice systems, even today, can be intimidating. But imagine a legal system in 930 where you, as a woman, had virtually no standing, no voice, and no real hope of fair representation. This profound legal disadvantage was yet another formidable barrier, making the pursuit of divorce for women almost entirely impossible. The law, simply put, was not on her side. In most early medieval societies, women were, for legal purposes, considered perpetual minors. This didn't mean they were treated like children in every aspect of life, but it meant they couldn't typically act independently in legal matters. An adult woman, even if married or widowed, usually needed a male guardian, her father, her brother, or most commonly her husband, to represent her in any legal proceeding. Think about that. If you wanted to accuse your husband, you would need his permission or the permission of your father or brother to even bring the case. It's like trying to sue yourself with your own permission slip. Surviving legal documents and scholarly analyses of early medieval jurisprudence make it strikingly clear that the legal system of 930 was overwhelmingly structured by and for men, offering little to no genuine recourse for women seeking to dissolve a marriage. Now imagine stepping into a court of law in 930. What would it look like? It wouldn't be a polished courtroom with a robed judge and lawyers debating fine points of law. It might be an outdoor assembly, a local lord's hall, or a church court meeting. The judges would be men typically powerful lords, their representatives, or ecclesiastical figures. The juries, if they existed at all in a recognizable form, would be comprised entirely of men. Witnesses would predominantly be male, their testimony often carrying more weight than a woman's, whose testimony might even be considered unreliable or emotional. Furthermore, education was a luxury, and legal education was almost exclusively for men. Women were generally not taught Latin, the language of most legal documents and church courts. They weren't trained in rhetoric or argumentation. How could you possibly present a compelling case, understand the complex procedures, or argue against a powerful husband and his male kin in such an environment? The legal processes were often convoluted, deeply traditional, and required significant resources and knowledge to navigate. And then there was the issue of proof. How would a woman prove cruelty, neglect, or abuse that occurred within the private confines of her home? Without external witnesses, without legal rights to summon evidence or conduct investigations, her word alone would likely be dismissed. Even if she could articulate her grievances, the system was designed to uphold the status quo and the patriarchal structure of the family. The very idea of rights for women, especially rights that could challenge the authority of a husband, was incredibly different from what we understand today. Even in systems where a woman theoretically had some limited recourse for extreme circumstances, like a husband's impotence or a grave sin, accessing that recourse was a maze of impossible obstacles. Costs involved in initiating any legal action were prohibitive for most women who, as we discussed, had no independent economic power. Process was lengthy, often requiring travel, payment to scribes or officials, and sustained effort, resources no woman trying to escape a marriage would possess. Think about the principles of the Salic law. While older, its spirit permeated much of European legal thought regarding female inheritance and legal standing, often restricting women's rights to own and pass on property, and reinforcing the idea of male guardianship. While specific legal codes varied across different regions, the underlying principle was almost universal. Women were dependent entities within the legal framework. They were not independent actors. This fundamental lack of legal agency meant that even if a woman felt her marriage was truly unlawful or unholy, she would have no effective way to challenge it through the established legal channels. She was effectively silenced by the very system designed to administer justice. Number 2. Family pressure and alliances. Imagine you're a woman in 930 AD and you're contemplating divorce. You've weighed the terrifying religious consequences, the absolute economic destitution, the soul-crushing social stigma, and the unbearable thought of losing your children. But then, another immense pressure would descend upon you. The weight of your own family and the realization that your marriage isn't just about you and your husband. It's an alliance, a strategic bond between two families, and breaking it would unleash a torrent of shame and potential disaster upon your own kin. In early medieval society, marriages were rarely, if ever, simple matters of romantic love or individual happiness. They were often carefully orchestrated strategic maneuvers. Think of them as political, economic, and social alliances between powerful or even not so powerful families. A marriage could secure land, resolve feuds, gain influence, or consolidate power. Your family had invested heavily in your marriage, perhaps through a substantial dowry paid to your husband's family, or through the prestige and connections gained by linking your lineage with his. Historical accounts, particularly those focusing on aristocratic and landed families, often detail how intricately marriages were woven into the fabric of family power and prestige, making individual desires for separation a threat to the entire kin group's standing. Now imagine breaking that alliance. If you, as a woman, sought a divorce, it wouldn't just bring shame upon you. It would unravel those carefully constructed alliances, potentially leading to political instability, economic losses, or even feuds between your birth family and your husband's family. Your own family would likely see your desire for divorce not as a personal yearning for freedom, but as a dangerous and selfish act that threatened their collective interests and honor. This meant immense pressure from your own parents, siblings, and extended relatives to make it work, no matter how dire the circumstances within your marriage. They would not want to see their investment wasted, their alliances jeopardized, or their family name dragged through the mud. A divorced daughter or sister would be a source of profound embarrassment, a living testament to a failed strategy. And then there was the very real question. If you left your husband, would your family even take you back? In many cases, the answer would be a resounding no, or at least a highly reluctant acceptance with severe limitations. You would be seen as a burden, someone who had brought shame upon the family, and who had disrupted their plans. They might be reluctant to feed and house you, especially if their own resources were stretched thin. You would likely be relegated to a dependent and often miserable position within their household, stripped of any status you might have had as a wife. The fear of being disowned or being taken back only to be treated as a pariah within your own family was a powerful deterrent. The concept of individual happiness was very much a secondary concern in this era, if it was a concern at all. Duty to one's family, to one's lineage, and to the stability of the social order trumped personal desires. Your marriage was a reflection of your family's standing and strategy, and to break it was to betray that duty. This intense, pervasive family pressure, combined with the grim prospects of ostracization even within your own kin, made divorce for women an almost unimaginable act of defiance, fraught with severe and far-reaching consequences for everyone involved, especially for the woman herself. Number 1. Physical tangibility and no safety net. Let's be blunt. Life in 930 AD was harsh. There was no widespread centralized law enforcement as we understand it today, no police force, no social welfare programs, no women's shelters. Justice was often local, informal, and heavily dependent on the power and influence of strong families or lords. In such a world, being a woman without the protection of a husband or a strong male kin group was like standing in a storm without shelter. And it made divorce for women not just difficult, but frankly life-threateningly dangerous. Imagine for a moment that against all odds, a woman somehow managed to overcome the religious, economic, social, and family pressures to leave her marriage. What would she face next? She would be profoundly terrifying, vulnerable. First, there was the immediate risk of violence from her husband. If she dared to leave, especially without his permission, she could face severe beatings, imprisonment, or worse. There was no one to call, no authorities to intervene effectively. A husband's authority over his wife was vast, and often enforced with physical coercion. Beyond her husband, a lone woman was a target in a lawless or loosely governed landscape. Vagabondage, or wandering aimlessly without ties, was an extremely dangerous existence. She would be at severe risk of robbery, assault, and exploitation from anyone she encountered. Without the protection of a male household head, she was seen as fair game. There was no place of safety, no public assistance, and then there was the very real prospect of absolute destitution. Without a husband or a supportive family, how would she find food, shelter, or basic sustenance? She couldn't own land. Her work options were limited, and charity was often unreliable and insufficient for independent survival. She would be constantly battling starvation, exposure to the elements, and the pervasive threats of disease. In a world with no organized health care, many would quickly succumb to illness or malnutrition. In the direst of circumstances, a woman without protection and means could easily be forced into exploitative situations to survive. This could mean becoming a beggar, a serf tied to a lord's land without real rights, or tragically forced into prostitution, a path from which there was virtually no return and which carried an even greater social stigma. Concept of safety nets, welfare, government assistance, shelters for victims of domestic abuse simply did not exist. Every single day would be a fight for survival, a constant battle against the elements and human predation. Everyday life in 930, as revealed through fragmented records and archaeological findings, was harsh and unforgiving for those without the protection of a strong family unit or powerful male guardian, rendering a lone woman profoundly vulnerable. Some women, particularly those from wealthier families, might have considered joining a convent as an escape. However, this wasn't a universal escape route, and it came with its own set of conditions. Many convents required a dowry to admit a new nun, meaning a woman still needed family support to enter. And once inside, she was giving up any hope of a conventional life, of marriage or children, dedicating herself entirely to religious service. It was a commitment, not merely a temporary shelter. For the vast majority of women, especially commoners, this option simply wasn't available. The sheer overwhelming danger of existing as an independent, unprotected woman in 930 AD was arguably the most visceral and immediate deterrent to seeking a divorce. It was a choice between an unhappy marriage and a very real, very terrifying threat to one's physical safety and very life.